So now I introduce you to Mr. Jerome Spears.
Well, Paulette, thank you very much
You are welcome.
For that introduction. And again, it's a pleasure to be back with my brethren out in Arizona. It's always good to be able to talk genealogy and family discovery and new tools and techniques that might be of help to people. I can start off by saying, let me share my screen and bring up my slides. I'll start off by saying this year, and on this presentation, there's going to be 2 stars, and those 2 stars are going to be letters, which I'm going to introduce, which are older than I am. So, you know, I gotta say, that's getting there to do that. But we'll also have an opportunity to talk about some family history, some geography, some genetic tree, family tree information, and certainly the DNA piece. When I get to the DNA piece, you may see some things which are familiar, or you may see some things which are a little bit new. I do go out to the edges of discovery sometimes. Some of the approaches and methods that I'm using, my hope is that we'll garner some discoveries that maybe we wouldn't garner if we didn't kind of stretch the envelope a little bit. So if you've seen some of these approaches, particularly when I get into the visual phasing and some of the other things, that's great. If you haven't seen it before, again, this will at least just give you some idea of some things that might be out there that could be of help to you, particularly if you've got a lot of siblings and you want to try to incorporate visual phasing techniques into your methods. Did everybody see the screen okay? Let me ask that question. Looks like I'm seeing heads nod, okay. So then what we're going to try to do is to go through a couple of items this afternoon or this morning. We'll start by talking a little bit about 1954. I will introduce the 2 family treasures, the letters that I've been referring to. I will acquaint you with a great uncle of mine, William Edmund Bankins. Then we'll talk in more detail about the 2 letters. We'll discuss the chain of custody. We'll dibble and dabble into some Native American heritage. And then we'll use DNA tools and visual phasing methods to flush out and see if we can't get some additional clarity using some of these methods to help us in that regard. And then we'll conclude on the back end and entertain any questions you might have. So with that, we'll start with 1954. 1954, President of the United States was Dwight Eisenhower. The current King of England was 6 years old. A movie that was pretty popular during that time was From Here to Eternity. I Love Lucy and Gunsmoke were 2 very popular TV shows that were on during that time. And if you had a television, a floor model television, it may have looked something like the picture that's in the middle of the screen here in the 1950s. In the NFL championship, the Cleveland Browns beat the Detroit Lions, and Willie Mays in the World Series made his memorable catch. Rocky Marciano was the heavyweight champion of the world, and gasoline was 29 cents a gallon in 1954. If you were driving around in automobiles during that time, your model cars may have looked something like what you're seeing here. And in listening on the radio, you're lucky if you had 10, maybe 10 stations in your given area, but your radio probably looked something like what you're seeing in the center of the picture there. I won't stay on this screen long. It's a busy slide, but certainly you can look at it in more detail and replay. But 1954 was also the year where the Supreme Court overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. On a more personal note, the Spears 1, I'm circling my sister here at this point, the Spears 1 became the Spears 2 in 1954 with the entry of my brother into the world. I would come along in 1956. This picture was made in 1957. By the 1960s, we had 2 more siblings to round out the Spears 3 to the Spears 5 and knock on wood, was still going strong even to this day. So a lot was going on in the 1950s. This was an era where we didn't have flat screen TVs, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have laptops, we didn't have text messages and emails. Things were done a lot more simply. Communication was a lot more simple as well. Word of mouth, and sometimes putting pen to paper and sending letters. Letters often delivered by hand. So it was an interesting time. I wanted to place 1954 in context as we get into the two family treasures that we're going to discuss. So, and here they are, the two family treasures that we have in our family. Two letters written by an individual, and we'll talk about this in more detail as we go. The 1910 letter was written by an individual named William Edmund Bankins, and he wrote the 1910 letter to his mother, Camilla Smith. Many years later, we have on hand a 1954 letter that Edmund Bankins also wrote to his nephew. He called him Bill or Billy. His name was actually Eugene Jordan. We've never gotten to the bottom of how he got that nickname, but that's maybe another story for another day. Here's the timeline for William Edmund Bankins. He was born in 1867 in Southern Maryland, just after the end of slavery, actually. He was raised in Southern Maryland, spent his early years there, got his formal education there, and at a young age, he decided to do something that many of the other people in that area didn't do. He decided to leave. He packed up and joined the railroads, decided to go out to see the rest of the country. And it was from his location in Chicago where he landed, where he wrote this letter to his mother in 1910. The 1954 letter that he wrote at the age of 87, almost near the end of his death, was also written from Chicago as well. So this is the timeline of Edmund Bankins. His first name was William, but all the people, at least back east, called him by his middle name. So he was known either by William or most commonly by Edmund. And like I said, he ended up in Chicago, where he got to see all the big cities up and down the eastern part of the United States and in the Midwest and so forth. On his death certificate, you notice it says Negro Porter Railroad. You put those three things together, you're probably already ahead of me in this regard in figuring Edmund was a Pullman porter. And so the family was very pleased and proud to have a distinguished Pullman porter in our midst. If you're from Southern Maryland, you're farming, you're doing the rudimentary things that you would do in that kind of agricultural environment. And for anybody to decide to pull up roots and start to see the big cities and other towns and other parts of the country, he was certainly an individual that generated a lot of pride amongst the family, and maybe one of the few individuals to be that extensive in terms of being able to get away and see other things. The Pullman Porters were quite renowned, as I'm sure many of you know. They were involved in establishing unions. They kind of got the Black middle class off the ground with some of the groundbreaking work that they did. So just on so many fronts, to know that we had in our midst a Pullman porter is a big deal in our family still to this day. To look at the family tree a little bit, Edmund's parents were Basil Bankins and Camilla Smith. Here it was seen at the top. He had a pretty large family, about 9 siblings. And here I'm circling Edmund Bankins. I'm also circling my grandmother as we go through this as well, and that this will become clearer as we go. Edmund had a lot of nieces and nephews generated from his many siblings. And so my grandmother, Louise Marie Stevens, who married a Jordan, was one of those many nieces and nephews that William Edmund Bankins would have throughout his life. This is a screenshot of my grandmother at a younger age. And here's also a picture of her, at least a partial picture of her much later on in her life. And she's standing behind one of her first cousins, another nephew of Edmund Bankins. This is Leonard Bankins. this is Eugene, also known as Billy. And the other star I have by one of the nephews we'll talk about as we go down the line. The family lines were Stevens, Bankins, Field, Fenwick, among others. So some of the many nieces and nephews that were in this pretty large family. If you know anything about Southern Maryland, St. Mary's County in particular, everybody's related to everybody else, just one way or another. And in this instance, my immediate family was no different in that regard. My grandfather, Jerome Carter Jordan, married Marie Stevens. Marie Stevens was the first cousin of Leonard Bankins. Leonard Bankins marries my grandfather's older sister, Marion Beatrice Jordan, and that's the way the cookie crumbled. And it's par for the course for how a lot of these families would end up being related multiple ways, because close individuals, sometimes even folks that might be distant cousins, are marrying in the family and going back and forth, and that's just the way it was. So here we go back to the two treasures, the two letters, and I'm mindful of the fact that these letters were written again by Edmund Bankins, the Pullman Porter, who was born just after slavery, a period which of course made it illegal for us to even be able to read or write. And so to be able to have in his own penmanship, in his own handwriting, tangible evidence of this individual getting to the point where he had those skills down very well. And we have these documented records to show just the progression that took place. I must have hit something. What did I just do? The progressions that took place just from that period of time in terms of him being able to do this. So I want to get into this in more detail, but I also wanted to make it a little bit more clear so we could see it and analyze it a little better. So I've transcribed the handwritten text into type form so we can see it a little better and work our way through it. One of the things that I'm charged to do, this is kind of self-imposed, as we have these treasures, these records, I want to ensure that this information gets passed forward to the generations that come behind. I also want to ensure that if there's anything that maybe is not 100% accurate or misleading or flat out wrong, if we can use modern tools and technologies to find and then make these appropriate adjustments as necessary, we want to be able to do that as well. And so I kind of have a dual end objective as I'm looking through these letters and thinking in terms of, are these records going to withstand the test of time? Do they still make sense? Are they still viable? So that's partly what I'm planning to do. So as he kicks off writing to his mother in 1910, he kicks off by talking about him being ill. Now he's 43 years old at this point, and he's not just a little bit ill. He's in pretty bad shape to a point where he's bedridden. So we don't know the specifics relating to his illness, but he's in pretty bad shape, it looks like, in 1910 as he's writing his mother. The other takeaway that we get from this is that he's talking about one of his sisters, our Aunt Carrie, Carrie Bankins, in the letter. And then he goes on to tell his mother to ensure that she lets the two nephews, Bill and Leonard, know that he plans to write them soon. So again, this goes to the idea that all of the folks in Southern Maryland, they're on farms, plantations, or whatever you want to call it, sharecropping and doing those sorts of things in Southern Maryland, in this rural environment. And they've got this Pullman Porter that's going to Chicago and going to New York and going into other parts of the Midwest and seeing the world. He became an individual that was sought after. They wanted to see the country through his eyes, if you will, and understand what kind of experiences he was having. And also because he was older, they wanted to learn from him because they wanted him to pass down the knowledge that he may have been able to do. So these are some of the important nuggets that we get from the 1910 letter. The 1954 letter, again, written many years after the 1910 letter, and we believe there were other letters in between there, but these may have been the only two that survived just life and things happening over time. So we've committed that to type as well so that we could see it a little bit more clearly. And again, the letter was written to Billy. My goal is to kind of look at the letter, to pull from it bits and pieces which can help the genealogical journey, some of the research that we're undertaking, to try to validate where we can. If we need to make some tweaks or adjustments, do that as well. And so he kicks off this 1954 letter talking to his nephew almost in the same way he kicked off the 1910 letter talking to his mother. Forgive me for not getting back to you, but my health has not been good. I'm in bad shape. I'm suffering in pain. I can't even sleep at night. So again, we're getting an indication that he was having some pretty severe health issues. And that's just a thread that seems to be there as it relates to our Edmund Bankins. And then he gets into the second paragraph where he goes, now about slavery. So in that moment, my sense is that Billy and maybe some of the other nieces and nephews, they've been asking him about all sorts of things, and they want to get knowledge from this older uncle who's seen the world, who at least seen different parts of the country. And so he goes on to say to them, the first slaves were sold to Virginia, 20 in 1620. And of course, it doesn't take much for us to kind of connect those dots and figure he's got the year off by 1 year, but he's talking about 1619 and those 20 Angolans that came to Point Comfort in Virginia during the Jamestown era. So we can check that box. He's right on point in terms of providing information as he knew it and understood it to his nephew related to some of the periods dealing with slavery. Then he goes on to talk about his father, Basil Bankins. And he says, father was born not far from Leonardtown, in a place called Society Hill. He was owned by the family of Neals. Now, so yes, he was enslaved. He knew who the enslaver was. The family was Neal. There was a country doctor and the doctor's son, who also became a doctor. They both were named Francis Neal. They went by Frank or Francis Neal, both country doctors. Then he goes on to tell his nephew that when the younger Neal married, our Basil Bankins was sold to him for $1,000. So this was a movement via from father to son when the son was about to marry and leave Society Hill to move to Rosedale, where the family was raised. So just again, priceless information that who knows where else we would have even a shot at getting our arms or hands around these types of nuggets of really specific information relating to the family. If we look at some of the geography, Edmund says that Society Hill was located outside of Leonardtown in St. Mary's County in Southern Maryland. And that's where Basil Bankins was born. He was sold for $1,000 from father to son, where then he moved to Rosedale. Rosedale is off of the Patuxent River, where Society Hill was off of the Potomac River. So this was a pretty major movement for Basil to undertake with the person who had paid that money to have this move take place. And so once we realized where Rosedale was, out of the 3rd district in Southern Maryland, St. Mary's County, into the 6th district, we also then quickly realized that he was not far from another pretty famous plantation, a plantation known as Sodderly Plantation. But just sticking with Rosedale for a while, we were able to go to the Maryland Historical Trust to get specific information about this Dr. Neal. And here is a record that says in 1862, Neal was the owner of a 303-acre plantation called Rosedale Manor. So again, we're validating and backing up the information that Edmund is putting in this letter to his nephew. It also goes on to say that he was confined in the DC prison for a year because, like so many of the landowners in Southern Maryland during this time around the Civil War, he was a Southern sympathizer. And those sympathies landed him in jail for a year. So we get some idea of where his head was as a result to some of this information that we're able to pull out of documents as it relates to Francis Neal. This information talks about several years later how he sells more than half of his land to a guy named Bond at some point. And so we're just grabbing additional information that we can use to enhance the knowledge that in Edmund's letter he already conveyed to his nephew. So there's more things that we can find, and we want to be able to do that to give the folks behind us more information than they otherwise would have had. Rosedale later became a state park, Greenwell State Park. So Rosedale was no longer there. You don't see too many references to Rosedale, but we have the 1954 letter that tells us all about it and makes us aware to at least do queries and searches through documents to find that term and the term Neal. So you Google Neal, you Google Rosedale, you look for those things because the 1954 letter is tipping you in that direction. In some of the documentation referring to Greenwell, they make reference to a Dr. Walter Hanson Briscoe, who used the stable, the tobacco barn, as a stable at some point. So what is this connection with Walter Briscoe? Well, he was the owner of Sodderly Plantation. And as the crow flies, Sodderly is in very close proximity to Rosedale on the Patuxent River in southern Maryland. And so this country doctor was just upriver from Frank Neal, the other country doctor who was at Rosedale. And so we now can begin to put more pieces to the puzzle and connect the dots, just knowing more information and being able to do our own independent research to find additional information. If we go to the 1860 census, we find physician and farmer, Dr. Walter Briscoe, who was at Sodderly. And on the same page, not too far away, here's our Frank Neal, physician and farmer, also on the same page in the same district, the 6th district, with in Hollywood, Maryland, in close proximity to Sodderly Plantation. So Rosedale Manor and my enslaved great-grandfather would have been there as well. So all these records are helping us to build on the information that we're getting, and a lot of the letter from Edmund Bankins is helping us to key off of that. Some of you may know the name Agnes Kane Callum. She was a remarkable historian and genealogist. She started doing work in southern Maryland, doing research on her immediate family, many of whom were enslaved at Sodderly Plantation. But since she was so committed to doing the work, as she was getting information on Sodderly, as she found other information, she grabbed and compiled that information as well. And literally, by the time she was done, she had garnered information to help all of the African Americans in southern Maryland know so many things about their families. And the reason why we have these detailed records from, in this instance, Dr. Neal, in 1864, when slavery was abolished in Maryland, the landowners in Maryland wanted to get a similar deal to the deal that Lincoln gave the folks in the District of Columbia in 1863. They were actually given reparations for any of the enslaved people that Lincoln made release as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Maryland people said, well, we want that deal too. And so they began to compile all of the information on the enslaved people that they had to try to get reparations from Maryland the way the folks in DC had done in the previous year. And to the best of my knowledge, they never got a dime from Maryland in this effort. But yet those records that they created were such that many years later, Agnes Kane Callum was able to come along, compile all the information, digitize it, get it into online mediums where we could be able to see it and make use of it. And to this day, many people are now able to see their ancestors by name predating the 1870 census because of the work of Agnes Kane Callum. So we always want to pay tribute and salute her in this work. But we get to see Basil Bankins again listed by Frank Neal, who at the time owned Rosedale Manor. And we also have my grandmother's father, John Lewis Stevens, who was just at the age of 12, who was also enslaved by the Neals, who was there as well. So we're getting all kinds of information as a result, in many instances, tipping off of or pulling off of that 1954 letter. If you're not familiar with Sodderly Plantation, it was established in 1703. It's been around a long, long time. It survived wars and everything else you can imagine. It's still there as an historic site, as an historic landmark in southern Maryland. And there were, of course, many enslaved people to keep these folks living comfortable. And there would have been many more slave cabins than the one that's pictured here. on this dirt road back in the day. But over time, many of these cabins were destroyed or removed or just torn down just because they were in bad shape. And when it became clear that there was only one left, Agnes King Callum and others insisted that nothing happened to that cabin. If there was going to be tours and conferences and weddings and different things happening up on the hill in the big house, where people were looking at the chandelier and the winding staircase and the china on the table, she also wanted to make sure that there was a record on how our ancestors were living during that time as well. And so at her insistence and other people's insistence, this slave cabin remains. And the intent is as long as the big house is there, this one lone slave house is going to be there too. So that you can see the dirt floors and the low ceilings and the conditions that the people of color were having to endure while these folks were up on the hill living the life that they were living. So, so this is Sotterley, which is just down the road from where Rosedale would have been. And so we're able to just use our own modern research and techniques to get information on a lot of these places, but we're keying off of this letter that maybe we wouldn't even known about some of these things if Edmund Baggins hadn't written that letter to his nephew in 1954. So we're hitting home runs up and down the line with everything he said about his father. So nothing to complain about, nothing to argue about in terms of the authenticity or the accuracy of Edmund's letter up to this point. So now we move from Edmund's father, Basil Baggins, to Edmund's mother, Camilla Smith. He talks about Camilla Smith being from a place called Susquehanna, and that it was near the mouth of the Patuxent River. So again, if we go down the Patuxent River from Sotterley, down past Rosedale Manor, out of the 6th district into the 8th district, and just before the Patuxent River empties into the Chesapeake Bay, right there on the point, there's where Susquehanna Plantation was located. And so Edmund's description of where it would be was right on point, and all the geography backs that up. She spent the first 33 years of her life enslaved there on this plantation, working for a family called the Carrolls, specifically Henry James and Elizabeth Carroll. She was the nurse, cook, personal maid to Elizabeth Carroll and the seamstress on Susquehanna Plantation. If the Carroll name is familiar to any of you, it's because this was a powerful Catholic family that has tentacles all over Maryland, at least, perhaps in even other areas beyond Maryland. But the most famous of them would be Charles Carroll, the signer. He's called the signer because he was one of, I think there was about 50 or so who actually signed the Declaration of Independence. And Charles Carroll represented Maryland in that effort in 1776. He also has the distinction of being the last survivor of those 50 or so individuals who signed the document. So he outlived all of his other members, and living to November of 1832, he was the last of them to pass. And so that's kind of his claim to fame. His father was Charles Carroll of Annapolis, whose father was Charles Carroll, the settler, who came from Europe originally in the 1600s to the colonies in Maryland. So these Carrolls have a long history. Many of them are known for many things. James Carroll commissioned a ship called the Margaret, and he brought 100 Africans from Sierra Leone to the Annapolis area in Maryland in 1718. And then there's another Carroll who some of you may know the name, John Carroll. He's the founder of Georgetown College. If you've ever been on the campus at Georgetown, there's a monument right in front of Healy Hall in the middle of the campus, and that is none other than John Carroll. So again, these were famous, rich, and powerful people. This property here, Doe Reagan Manor, is located in Howard County, Maryland. And it's still there, still in existence, still owned by the Carroll family. In fact, the signer, he's buried there on this property. And one of the Carrolls was famously quoted in a paper one point in saying, "Only God, the Indians, and the Carrolls have owned this land." So they go back, you know, you can look at just all of the, you can Google these names and bring up all these people and get more than your fill of the Carroll family and their impact on Maryland and perhaps even other parts outside of Maryland. So that's when my great-great-grandmother was enslaved on Susquehanna with the Carroll family. And she was at the point of the Susquehanna, the Patuxent River and the Chesapeake Bay. This is just an aerial photograph of the same place. And you notice the sandy beach area right here that I'm highlighting. This was a pristine area. You can imagine the Carroll family living high on the hog, sitting there on this particular site, having the view of the water as they had all these enslaved people running around doing all the work for them. There are landmarkers that are there commemorating this particular plantation, and wherever we're in that area, we make this a spot to make sure we capture pictures commemorating where our Camilla Smith lived for the 30-some years of her life. Whether it's a small group or a large group, that's always part of the ritual that we go through. As I stated, it was right there on the point, and here's a picture of some of the family on the actual beach, and this is the Patuxent River here, and out underneath these clouds would be the actual Chesapeake Bay. So this just gives you an idea, a ground level view of what the surroundings look like. I'm speaking about Susquehanna in the past tense because it's no longer there. And if any of you don't know the story, it was in bad shape. It was in disrepair when World War II was about to break out, and we were preparing military bases all around the country. It was determined that they were going to put a military base where Susquehanna used to be, and they were going to tear it down to make room for the runways. Somehow they were able to convince Henry Ford, the automobile maker, that this was a very, one of the few remaining homes that was still in decent enough shape that might be of some value to him, and that he was convinced that he could use this in this new indoor-outdoor museum that he was building in Dearborn, Michigan, outside of Detroit. So Henry Ford, being one of the richest men in the world at that time, said, okay, you convinced me. Don't tear that one down, I'll come back for it. And he disassembled this home, packed it up, moved it 600 miles to Dearborn, Michigan, reassembled it, gave it a facelift, and Susquehanna Plantation is in Michigan to this day because of Henry Ford. And the place he has there is called Greenfield Village. If you're ever in Detroit or in the Michigan area and you want to go by there, you just Google Greenfield or Henry Ford or Dearborn, and it should come up. And so they use this plantation house to this day to do reenactments and have other sorts of events. Some of our family went to Dearborn to see this house personally, my aunt, my sister and I, in 2016, just to see where our Camilla Smith would have toiled in this home working for the Carrolls. And so it was a rewarding but also emotional visit to go see this house in person. But to know that it went from this in Maryland to this in Michigan is pretty remarkable. We call this one of the miracle houses because of it being saved, because of the condition it's in now, and because of it being on a place like it is, it's going to remain in this form for some time now. So, so Susquehanna is good, just putting it simply that way. And that if, you know, they're still doing these commemorations and reenactments and things of that nature, but we were certainly glad to be able to go there first front and see this place with our own eyes and touch it with our own hands. So all of this information we're getting is helping us to validate some of the things that that Edmund Bankins put in that 1954 letter. If we move down into this next area where he talks about Camilla's parents, he says her father was, and he used a hyphenated word, which I chose to update and just say mixed. It's just my call, not anybody else's, but it was 1954. It is what it is. But he's basically saying that Camilla's mother was an English white woman and that her father was an Indian Sioux chief. So, okay, very interesting. So now how we're trying to put the green checks by things and validate things as we go, how in the world are we going to be able to do something with these particular items, if we even can? So that's the next thing that we're working against. We have an actual portrait of Camilla Smith, and it's mounted on a wall in West Baltimore, next to my aunt, Camilla Parham, who's named after her great grandmother, Camilla Smith. And here's my Uncle Joe and two of my first cousins. And the folks in Dearborn, Michigan, when they found out that there was an actual portrait of Camilla, they said, well, please give us that portrait. We'll honor it. We'll mount it over in the hallway in Susquehanna Plantation to commemorate your ancestor. And we replied, well, there's at least 3 people you're going to have to get to that portrait. I don't think you're going to have much luck with that, but would it suffice to give you a picture? So we end up giving them a photocopy, but the portrait still remains on this wall in West Baltimore. This is my grandmother, and this is my aunt, who will be 97 years old next month, still with us. We'll talk more about them in a little bit. So we're still now trying to deal with this English white woman and Indian Sioux chief, and how we're gonna work this through. So at this point, we can look at some of the takeaways from Edmund and the letters. We know that he was not well, perhaps for long periods of his life. We also know that he kept in touch with his family and was interested in them, even though he was far away. We know from the letters that when asked about what he knew about slavery in the family, he shared and passed down what he knew. He noted Society Hill, Susquehanna Plantation by name, and also Rosedale, which were clues to help us do additional research. And he noted the amount that his father was sold from one Neo to the other, and that there was some at least partial Native American lineage on his mother's line. So these are the things that we're garnering from these very valuable records. And again, by time we get to 1954, he's 87, still sounds like he's in pretty bad shape. Perhaps he's been in bad shape for the bulk of this period of time. He ends up passing away in 1962, but he makes reference in talking to Billy when he says, forgive me for the long delay in writing you. So that gives me some idea that somewhere in these 44-year gap, they had some discussions back and forth. These aren't the only 2 letters that would have been done between the family and Edmund, but these are the only 2 that survived. So we take that into account as we go, as I take a deep breath to continue. So now I want to get into the custody. Again, we've got Edmund Bankins, his parents, Basil Bankins, Camilla Smith. Again, circling my grandmother for a reason. When my grandmother's mother died, she died when my grandmother was just 2 years old, and they were in Baltimore at the time. When Helena Bankins died untimely, it was decided that her child, Louise Marie, would be moved from Baltimore to St. Mary's County to live with and be raised by her grandparents, Basil Bankins and Camilla Smith. So she became almost like a younger sibling to the aunts and uncles in St. Mary's County as a result. So she knew them quite well. And she outlived all of the siblings, or in this case, her aunts and uncles, such that when Camilla Smith passed away, she was the one to handle all of her affairs at the end of Camilla Smith's life. And of course, some of the cherished documents that she would have kept would have been this 1910 letter from her son. And so that's how my grandmother acquired the 1910 letter. Looking at Edmund and Billy, Billy was, again, this letter written to him in 1954, but Billy is also the older brother of my grandfather, Jerome Jordan, who is the husband of Marie Jordan. And so when Billy passed away, his younger brother, Jerome, handled his affairs, which means he was able to acquire some of the cherished things that he would have had on hand, which would have included the 1954 letter that Edmund wrote to him. And so now Jerome Jordan has the letter. And when he passes, his wife gets the letter. So my grandmother ended up with both the 1910 letter and the 1954 letter. And just looking at the tree and understanding some of the genealogy and the connective tissue, it's pretty easy to kind of, work your way back through that to get to that point to understand why our grandmother has these 2 letters. And so she had the letters until she passed. When she passed, everything conveyed to my aunt, who, like I said, is going to be 97 next month. She has all these documents to this day. And so that's kind of how we got there. So we still want to address this whole thing about seeing if we could put our arms around this Indian Sioux chief thing. So many people in the African American community get into the whole thing about my ancestor had high cheekbones and hair down to her back and all that sort of thing. And some people laugh and snicker and go, oh, you know, here you go, here we go again with the Native American thing. So at least in my family, we've not taken that approach until we find something to categorically refute what we've been given, because Edmund's batting 1,000 on everything else he's told his nephew up to this point. There's no reason for us to assume he's just making stuff up for the heck of it. So we're going to see what we can do with this. And so we go to the toolbox to try to work through this. Maybe DNA can be of some help. In looking at this, we note that Edmund said that his father had a white English mother and a Sioux Indian chief father. So that would mean that the English line that would come to the mother would be however that would flush out, and that the native line would be here. And if that native line was on the paternal side, that would mean that we could potentially use Y-DNA to run through that father's line and maybe get a definitive Y-DNA answer to help substantiate that claim. Now we're back to 1776 at this point. Autosomal DNA may or may not go back that far to help us in this regard, but maybe we'll be lucky enough to use the Y-DNA to help us in this regard. So the autosomal DNA will take you back several generations, but perhaps it's not going to cover everything and not hit everything, particularly when you're going back that far. Mitochondrial DNA would go back on the mother's line several generations, but again, we're not looking at a situation that's involving the mother at this point. We're looking at Frank Smith and the men that descend after that go after him. And so Y-DNA would be the vehicle that we perhaps might be able to use to answer that research question. To look at Y-DNA in general, we were successful in using Y-DNA to look at Basil Bankins, for example. We have Greg Bankins, a direct male descendant from Basil Bankins. We were able to take the Y-DNA test on him and got an answer of EP177 for his haplogroup, which ends up locating, at least for some period of time, in the Upper Nile region of Egypt. And so again, good information to know about some of the origins of Basil Bankins. On the Spears side of my family, we were able to use my brother, myself, and another co-Spears cousin to map back to our John Allen Spears, who predates us by several generations. And that haplogroup information takes us back into Senegal in this region with the various hits that we're getting on these Spears hits. So we're able to successfully use Y-DNA to go back very, very far in time to get some idea of what might be going on in people's past. If you think about Y-DNA and the various haplogroups that are generated from Y-DNA, I like to think about it in a more generic way, and that if you've got an E haplogroup, that's going to be Africa, whether it's Egypt, Senegal, Nigeria, or any other location. I think many of the haplogroups that come out of Africa are going to have an E designation to them. So if we think about Africa as being E, Europe as being R, and if you have any way to pin down or locate native DNA, one of the haplogroups that fall out of that on the male side is a Q haplogroup. So this would be an opportunity to try to test this to see if we can line up somebody and get a cousin to help us with this, what kind of hit we might get in this regard. I'm not that big a fan on a lot of the admixture or ethnicity of features that you'll see on a lot of the testing companies, but I am somewhat comfortable with at least using the GEDmatch World 9 tool, which breaks the Earth down into 9 major locations. And if somebody says, I'm looking at your DNA and you're this much Nigerian and this much Senegal and this much Mali, I kind of take that with a grain of salt. I would view it all as being West African, but whether or not the technology is sophisticated enough to get down to that level of detail, you know, I'm more comfortable with saying, okay, E. or in this case, using numbers 3, or West Africa, you know, as opposed to European, or using the numbers or the letters 4 or R, or using the numbers 1 or Q for any of the Native American. And so that level of detail I feel pretty comfortable with when I'm working with admixture and ethnicity and trying to use DNA to help me in terms of addressing some of those types of questions. So that's just the approach that I use. So we need now to find somebody that will help us with this. And I was able to find 2 cousins, one named Ed Johnson and another named Raymond Smith, who were matches who I knew were going to be on that side of the tree. Now, but again, I need more than just them to be matches on that side of the tree. I've got to have a continuous male link all the way back to Frank Smith for this to work, for me to be able to use the Y-DNA tool. So Ed, I can't use because Ed's grandmother is Lucy Smith. So now the male, it's a connection, it's an autosomal connection, but it's not going to allow me to use Y. Now, but Raymond, on the other hand, he goes up through Bernard, up to Julius. So now this guy has promise. This guy might be able to work if I can track him down. And so that was the approach I wanted to use. I'm holding this place as a placeholder to say, at least until now, we know there's some Native ancestry per Edmund's letter, and I'm putting him there, at least for the temporarily for this point, with the idea of examining this to see what kind of hit I get using some Y-DNA analysis. If we look at the admixture pieces for Ed Johnson, again, he's primarily African, but he's got some Europe, and he's got a pretty healthy amount of Native American ancestry that's registered on the GEDmatch tool for admixture. So again, that's promising to see him getting those types of hits. We go to Raymond, again, not as much Native, but still a noticeable amount of Native ancestry on Raymond as well, and along with the African and the European admixture that's being shown there. Now, this is another tool that you can use in GEDmatch where you can begin to analyze the chromosomes item by item, chromosome by chromosome, using this World 9 legend, if you will, to see where you're getting these particular hits. And so I wanted to just see specifically, okay, we see that they got the Native American. Can I then begin to see on which chromosomes this Native American signature is showing up? And you see this heavy amount of Native on chromosome 6 for Ed, and a good amount on chromosome 8 as well, and then other places. But at least on chromosome 14 and 17, these were places where both Ed and Raymond had hits that would in theory show up on the same spot. And so my effort here, my attempt here, was to see if there'd be any autosomal matches that I could find that I might be able to link up and find hits to these 2 individuals on chromosome 14 or chromosome 17. Then looking at the trees and other things, may be able to get some additional information and build out some things using 14 and 17 as my baseline for inquiry. You can enlarge and look at these in greater detail. Again, this is chromosome 14, and this is a laydown of Ed's admixture, a laydown of Raymond's admixture, and then this third graph shows you where they have DNA in common. So on chromosome 14, at about the 1 million mark, somewhere in that vicinity, they're sharing Native DNA. Okay. On chromosome 17, the same thing. It's not as much DNA for Ed, a little bit more for Raymond, but in common, they should have some amount of DNA at the beginning of chromosome 17. So this is a process that I want to try to go through to see if I can get lucky at this point and hit some autosomal matches in this regard. Unfortunately, they don't match each other on chromosome 14 or 17. So this effort to see what could come out of this didn't work the way I wanted it to, but I wasn't dissuaded by this. If you've got a lemon in your hand, squeeze it to make lemonade. I still had this very noticeable chunk of DNA that Raymond and Edmund did share on chromosome 10. They had a pretty good amount on chromosome 18 as well, and even on chromosome 21. But at least as it stood out on chromosome 10, I decided to circle back and look at chromosome 10 more closely. Now that I'm here, and now that my first effort to see if I could get some additional information. Didn't work. You want to swim, hunt, and fish in multiple lakes. That's always an advisable thing to do if you can, as much as your budget will allow. And in some of these instances, you can take your DNA and move it to some of the other companies at no additional cost. So that's always advisable to do that if you're able. In this case, Ed was nested in Ancestry, on the Ancestry platform. His cousin Raymond was nested in the MyHeritage platform. And since I'm in all of the major platforms, I went there and found that I was matching Raymond in MyHeritage as well. I was also matching a woman named Kalila Shabazz in MyHeritage. And not only was I matching both of them, I was matching both of them on the same spot, chromosome 10. So that means that A equals B, A equals C, and B equals C. That's triangulation. That means that we're all hitting on the same spot, and that's an indication of common ancestry. So we're on to something now. And to look at her admixture information as it's presented by MyHeritage, she's got a pretty good signature of Native ethnicity as well in her readings. So this is all starting to line up and make a little bit of sense. When I look at Ed and Raymond, we already know they match each other, but I wanted to see what my situation looked like. And so I plugged myself in with Ed, I plugged myself in with Raymond, and we're all matching each other too. A equals B, A equals C, B equals C. Again, there's more triangulation happening on chromosome 10 as it relates to all of us. So this is a good news story. I know that there's a relation. It's on my maternal side of the family. It's more than likely going to run through this Smith line. And this guy, his Y DNA is going to help me if I could get him to do this. So that's in part where this is taking me. And so chromosome 10 is really now helping me to shore up some of this. If I work my way up through the ranks, I get from Bernard Smith on Raymond's side, through Ed Johnson on his side, up to Lucy Smith. Their common link is Julius Smith, who was a U.S. colored troop in the Civil War. He was also the younger brother of my Camilla Smith. So we're back to her again. Siblings at this level. And of course, who's their common father? Frank Smith, the guy we want to see if we can figure out. So now a lot of this is lining up based on just doing some sleuthing around and trying to see what we can see. So here I introduce visual phasing. Now, again, this is a bit of an eye chart, but if you Google or YouTube visual phasing, it will go into this. Andy Lee in particular does a lot of work on YouTube in explaining visual phasing in more detail. It's a method by which you can use your siblings and other cousins to go into the various chromosomes and tease out the specific places where you're getting specific DNA from each of your grandparents. Even if you haven't tested your own parents, it's going to allow for you to be able to get down to that level of detail with regard to your own laydown. And once you determine this DNA, that's what you get for the duration. So visual phasing allows you to do that. In order to do it, you've got to have a ton of cousins who are specifically identifiable and matching to those grandparents that you're interested in, so that when you see a match on a given chromosome, you know that match exists because you have in common with that match a Bankins hit, or you have in common with that match a Jordan hit, or you have in common with that match a Spears hit. So that's kind of how that process works. So in using visual phasing with all of your siblings and a lot of cousins, you can get to that level of detail. And here's where it can come in handy for you. It allows you to now, if you got a hit on your grandfather Jordan, you can go through door number 3 in this instance, and just for that specific chromosome, look for ancestors that just are linked to your grandfather Jordan, and not spend time behind door number 4 or door number 2 or door number 1, because on this chromosome, on this specific instance, you know there's a link that's linking you to a Jordan match, which has to keep you in door number 3. So it allows you to be more focused, more efficient in your research as you're trying to go perhaps deep back into your tree to find a potential match. So in looking at the DNA for chromosome 10, which was the one where we had all the matches on earlier, I pull up my cousin Raymond Smith and look at his placement of DNA, 29.7 centimorgan match between 18 million and 56 million on chromosome 10. So that's the address and specific location of the matching DNA that Raymond and I share. So I'm interested in knowing which ancestor that DNA is going to align with. And so if I line that up and look at it, here's my DNA profile on chromosome 10 on the maternal side. It's almost all Banken's DNA. It doesn't cross over or recombine in the Jordan DNA until the very end. And so I'm solidly linked and aligned with Banken's DNA in this area. And I know the grandparent that's responsible for that is my grandparent number 4, the Banken's DNA. Now, the other thing this allows for me to do, because I'm looking at all of my siblings, and so they can stop and help to validate some of the assessment. If in fact this is accurate, I'm looking at my sister Carolyn and my sister Renee. They should not match Raymond on chromosome 10 in this area because they're not getting Banken's DNA in this specific location. However, my brother Nason and my sister Sandy, although it's partial, they're getting some DNA that's Banken's related DNA as visual phasing has identified. That's where the split occurred for them. It happened halfway in between, where one's getting the DNA on the front end, the other's getting the DNA on the back end. So if I actually put them in and assess the hits that they might have with Raymond, and looking at it, we see Nason has a 10.6 centimorgan hit with Raymond on chromosome 10, 10.6 centimorgan hit with Raymond, chromosome 10. Sandy has a 12.7 chromosome hit, also with Raymond. In the appropriate spot, consistent with what we're showing, Carolyn has no match, Renee has no match. So the visual phasing is allowing for you to be able to see with some level of confidence and comfort that you're accurately placing the DNA that you are seeing underneath and behind the right grandparent. So I know this match that I have with Raymond is behind door number 4. And given everything we've already talked about, I know door number 4 leads me back to Basil Bankins, Camilla Smith, Frank Smith, and all that line where I'm trying to hunt. So I've got a lot more comfort and confidence in this Raymond Smith match as a result of doing some autosomal assessments using visual phasing to help out with that. So A equals B, B equals C, and A equals C. We're all triangulating on chromosome 10. It's all Banken's DNA. We've identified our most recent common ancestor on this specific chromosome on that specific segment as a result of this. So the other thing that I can do now that I know Raymond will work, I can go and spend money and go to the Family Tree DNA and get the Y-DNA test and run that test on Raymond to see what kind of a result we get, to see if he runs back through the line to hit Frank Smith and the other folks. But I don't have to do that in the case of Y, because there's another free tool called Y-Seq or Clad Finder. If you Google either one of those terms, this should come up. And Y-Seq allows you to take your DNA from MyHeritage, from Ancestry, from 23andMe. You can plug it in to this database, into this platform. And if you've got a male relative that you want to find out his Y DNA information on at no cost, Y-Seq will allow for you to be able to do that. And so I may at some point want to spend the money and get a more detailed Family Tree DNA, Y-DNA test for Raymond, but I just wanted to at least get a preliminary understanding and at this point, and I didn't have to spend the money to do it because Y-Seq is available. So I'm going to rely on that to work my way through the ranks in terms of trying to see what we can get for him. We're going to go back through this Y-DNA line and see what comes out of it. We run the Clad Finder, the Y-DNA on Raymond Smith, and we get an R, our cousin Raymond. And so what does that tell us? Well, if we look at it more specifically, it looks like we're in Europe. If we laser in even more closely, at least at some point in history, RU 106 was in Dusseldorf, just north of Dusseldorf in Germany. So this is European DNA. This is a European ancestor. That's the line, the male line for Raymond. And if it's the male line for Raymond, it's going to be that line for all of the ancestors going back on that line as well. And so while as a placeholder, I had the Native American here as I was studying and trying to get to the bottom of Edmund Rankin's notation, I now know the before has to be changed to an after, because Y-clad finder has told me that this is a European, not a Native individual. And the science-based Y-DNA result from Raymond all the way through the male line back to this allowed for me to be able to make that call. And so I now know that the Native ancestry that Edmund talks about in the letter would have had to have come from the mother's line versus the father's line as a result of getting this Y-DNA test. And so now I've updated my tree, I've tweaked my tree accordingly based on new information that I have available. And so as we look at Edmund's letter, again, I'm dotting all I's, I'm crossing all T's. At this point, I think he's right on point with everything he says. There's nothing that I would challenge or say is flat out wrong. The only thing I would do, I would make the adjustment going forward for the generations that come behind me to say not only was Camilla Smith's father mixed, her grandfather was mixed as well, as a result of us being able to do the Y-DNA test to note that her grandfather was more than likely of German and Native ancestry. And so that's how we leave that. The one last point that I'll make, again, Edmund was always talking about family, including people in family goings on and things of that nature. And so here he makes reference to his sister, Blanche Brankins, and her husband, John, living with the youngest son as of 1954. That young son would be, again, one of Edmund's nephews. And that nephew happens to be Leroy Julius Fenwick. And we found information that showed them all together, Blanche Brankins, John Fenwick, and Leroy Fenwick, all in St. Mary's County together. So again, almost in every instance, we were able to find information and things to backstop and validate the information that Edmund wrote in that letter in 1954. The Y-DNA helped us to make that one critical update in the family tree. But other than that, we think that this 1954 letter is golden, just like the 1910 letter was. And they're truly treasures that we have in the family that we hope to maintain and keep in the family for years and generations to come. And we're grateful to our Pullman Porter, Edmund Brankins, for putting us in position to be able to analyze and study these records to get more information on our family going down the line. And so these are the two treasures, the 1910 and 1954 treasures that we have in the family. Perhaps in some of your own research, if you've not gone into your attics or underneath the bed into shoe boxes, you never know what somebody may have left behind and what kind of nuggets might be contained in some letters that you might have someplace. So this could be another resource or research nugget that you might want to spend some time doing if you're able, because you never know what might come out of researching documents like this. So this is a little bit of information on the Brankins and Jordan family in Southern Maryland. Hopefully this has been of interest, and hopefully you may have found a few new wrinkles or things that might be helpful in your own research. I hope and think I covered most of what I wanted to try to address this afternoon. And with that, I'll conclude and answer any questions you might have.
Wow,
Thank you
Mr.
so
Spears, that was a lot and it was great. And I think it was so well put together that we haven't had too many questions come in.
Okay.
We have had some comments like masterful presentation, a treasure trove of information. Phyllis says, awesome presentation, Jerome. I always learn something new. You make it so easy to follow your presentation. Thank you again for your presenting to our society.